Welcome back to Offworld, the show where we talk about all things space exploration and pop culture. I'm Ariel Waldman.
And I'm Norm Chan. And Ariel, today, well, we're going to be talking about the long-awaited and highly anticipated premiere of Star Trek Picard.
We are definitely very excited here. We're doing a Friends of Tested episode, and we are diving into this first premiere episode of Star Trek Picard. So we definitely have spoilers about this first episode.
You should watch the episode first on CBS All Access before you listen. We're not going to go beat by beat throughout the episode. Really, we're going to be talking about the world building of Star Trek, but it really is going to be for fans. I'm so excited. Let's get started.
Okay, so we are all chomping at the bit with this one. Star Trek Picard just premiered. We've all seen it. We're all Trek fans. And yeah, on the show today is myself, Norm, and Kishore. And we also have a very special bottle of Picard wine. Kishore, do you want to talk about this before we jump into it?
We can't talk Picard without a nice beverage. This one was made in 2386 at Chateau Picard in France.
Good year.
Very good vintage for this wine. So this was a promotional wine that was put out recently, and by recently I mean 300 years in the future, to celebrate the premiere of Star Trek Picard.
You can hear the wine being poured if you're listening to the podcast. Yeah, we're going to drink while talking about it, but not because we're sad, but because it's a celebratory wine. This is a show we've been waiting for a very long time. Came out of nowhere, really, when they announced they were doing it. And now we see, like, not only what the show is about, but kind of really why, feels like why they did the show, why Patrick Stewart came back and brought back this character, this beloved captain, now retired, ex-admiral, retired from Starfleet, and what story threads he wants to conclude in his narrative arc.
Yeah, well, so cheers to that. Get started on this. All right, so my first question, most important question, especially for people who haven't seen Star Trek Picard yet and maybe are just about to dive into it or debating diving into it or debating paying for diving into it. Do you need to be a super Trekkie to enjoy Star Trek Picard? Now, I say this with knowing that both of you are probably super Trekkies, and I'm more on the, definitely fan, but not encyclopedic knowledge.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you were more of a Trekker than a Trekkie. I have two feelings about this. I think great Star Trek, you don't need the backstory because it's their character studies with an optimistic view towards the future, typically. So in that vein, I think once we get into this season and it gets rolling, I expect that to be true of this series as well. That being said, you should watch some TNG because otherwise you're going to miss sort of the backstory that I think sets up his character and where he is in his life right now. Because without watching some episodes of TNG where you see him as he was, it makes it harder to understand who he is now.
The relationships that he had with the crew, Data specifically, I think, is a big part of this show, but there are plenty of new characters as well. I think even if you're a diehard Star Trek fan or just a casual Star Trek fan, you're going to kind of go into this season premiere a little bit confused because they throw you right in. And I think the bigger thing is that unlike Star Trek Next Generation, when that aired and there were some stereo storylines in that two-parters, this is not going to be like an episode, villain of the week, mystery of the week. It is like with Star Trek Discovery, a season-long plot that is episode strung together. And that's probably the bigger thing to take into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have to watch some Next Generation to sort of have context. That said, as being on the casual side of a Star Trek fan, I grew up watching TNG. I grew up watching Picard, loved it. I can't say that I've recently caught up on it. And I can't say that I've watched, some of the movies that technically the plot intertwines into this timeline. And I say, having just watched, TNG when it was on TV more often, I felt like I was able to still enjoy this and still get enough of it. Maybe I'm missing a few details here or there, but I didn't feel like, wait, what's that about? And who's this? And what's, So I feel like if you've been a casual watcher of it, like you can still jump in. But if you're wanting to like really dive deep, then yeah, you might want to refresh.
If you don't know who Jean-Luc Picard is,
Well, then
you
that's a
probably
problem.
should
Yeah.
watch some
the
of the
myth,
yeah,
the legend.
And frankly, I actually don't think you need to watch a bunch of TNG episodes, even though that's kind of what I did. I think if you watch the movie Nemesis, I think that gives you most of what you need to dive in with enough background on who these people are, their relationships, to give you a grounding.
And it's rewarding on both those senses because diehard Star Trek fans will appreciate all the subtle Easter eggs and the dot connecting that the show does, even in the season premiere. But if you don't want to connect those dots, you can enjoy the acting because it turns out Patrick Stewart's a wonderful actor, and his performance here, he's running on all cylinders.
Yeah, absolutely. So jumping right into like the core of the first episode, because we're just talking about the first premiere episode today. I was really interested because, a huge part of this episode is about synthetics, creatures, for lack of a better term, humanoids, essentially, that are like Data. Kind of, it sounded like maybe lesser forms of Data slightly, but, Data like humanoids and sort of what's happened. And there's a lot of talk about what did happen and where they are now. For me watching it, there was a lot of parallels to Blade Runner, because in Blade Runner, there's the context of, all these replicants are promised as servants in Offworld colonies, and then they're no longer allowed, the replicants are no longer allowed on Earth because they mutinied. Similarly, in this first episode, synthetics mutinied and bombed Mars, and a lot of people died. 90,000 people died as a result. And now we're in this world where synthetics and the idea of them is like hugely debated and really sets the stage for what the whole plot and topic area is for this first episode. What were your thoughts on it?
I mean, as a kid watching Next Generation, I was really fascinated by the difference between an android and a cyborg, right? Cybernetic organisms maybe have some biological tissue, and in Star Trek Next Generation, you have the Borg as kind of the cyborg, and then you had the perfect android, which was Data, artificial human, and Data represented for the show the character that was finding his humanity, and it's the classic Star Trek trope: the least biologically, physically human character ends up being the most human, Spock, Data, and so on. And so you have those things coming together, I think, in this show, an opportunity to re-explore those. And also, like you said, reminding you of Blade Runner, it also reminded me of Battlestar Galactica, and what it meant for, the analogy of Cylons then being indistinguishable from humans, and in this case, androids being indistinguishable from humans.
I think there's no doubt, based on this first episode, that we know this series is going to tackle that question of what it really means to be human, what it means to belong. We know from interviews that Patrick Stewart has done, he said he was attracted to the script partly because of this sort of tension between like who belongs, who doesn't, that he saw parallels in Brexit with. It attracted him to this story. And so I can only imagine that what we see as we progress through the storyline is more and more of that. And I wonder if it's going to take the shape of what it means to be sentient, which is kind of a phrase we heard thrown around this premiere episode, or if they're going to try to take it in a different direction at all, because we've had a lot of discussions in sci-fi about that question of sentience, and some just masterpieces in science fiction that have tackled that. Like Ex Machina of recent memory, dealing with that in a really exceptional way. So I wonder if it's going to be a twist or if we're going to lean into that just wholeheartedly, and that's what this story is going to be about.
Yeah, well, and what about the science of it? Like, about this idea that a lot of times in sci-fi, it seems androids are created and then they help us, settle on Mars. Why is it that we need, or like, why do you think this keeps coming up? Like this idea of putting in a storyline that we have these androids and they are specifically helping us on another planet.
I love that too. The great question there is, why do they even need to look like humans, right? Because a lot of the scientists that we've talked to in past episodes, really talk about robots being kind of the way we get around the distance between stars and making space travel practical. It's not going to be necessarily humans as we understand now, but robots that do the traveling for us, or the work in this case for us. But they're really leaning into the mythology that Star Trek has built, in that the goal isn't just a robot, but the robot that somehow still has the humanoid form factor, maybe they like are designed to have some type of sentience, but that's not really necessary, even if you're talking about just labor.
Yeah, and frankly, I don't think they're being used in Star Trek in this like pure we need to get stuff done. They're like members of the crew that like hang out at like 10 Forward and stuff, and like Data used to make drinks all the time as his hobby. It's not exactly what you would call like useful, quote unquote. So I think that this is probably going to have a different flavor. I think it's just a pure writing mechanism to have us reflect on the humanity that exists. And so they're not really even looking at it from the science standpoint. It makes no sense to me from a science standpoint. Like, frankly, like if I was designing like androids, like as long as I didn't look at it as these are beings that have rights, I don't think I would imagine designing them in the way we see in Star Trek.
Yeah, but there is definitely in this episode like a lot of science consideration when it comes to ethics. So all of the synthetic research and sort of neurobiology hacking that had been getting done to like build better and better synthetic humans got canceled, and we see inside their lab that it's just a ghost town and it's empty. Like, what do you think about the fact that, it is actually, querying the ethics side of this, and there's the humanity side of this of like who's human and not, but then there's the science side of like how much should they be, creating these, neural, beings.
I think ethics is probably the thematic thing that they're challenging here, but from a plot perspective, I would say that's almost the politics of the world, and it's something we've seen in Star Trek before. The cloaking technology, for example, was something that was banned for use in warfare, and that was purely a practical political decision to make, the sides equal. That feels like that's more the case here. Like synthetics, flat out banned because of the fear of these type of rogue attacks.
Yeah, but I feel like it has parallels to like a lot of science hacking.
Oh, totally.
That's being done today,
I would imagine based off the cliffhanger that we saw, we're going to be headed in that direction. And we may want to hold off on talking about that cliffhanger, but given just sort of the advanced technology we saw towards the end of the episode, I imagine we're going to delve more into that interface. And there's probably going to be that classic Star Trek mumbo jumbo that shows up to explain some of the science. But I think that they kind of have to. They've kind of painted themselves this plot line where you're going to have to get into this place where we delve into like the sentience and their like who they're playing with in terms of. Can I just mention who's at the end at this point? Yeah, I mean, like by bringing the Borg into this, I think they're definitely going to straddle that line. We're going to get there, but I think what we've seen so far, I agree with Norm, is much more on the political side of things so far.
Yeah, I'd like to see them get a little more nuanced in terms of this idea of like AI and sentience, and because we do see AI taking place on Earth. It's just not physically independent humanoid sort of robots, but AI hasn't been banned, so clearly there's like shades of gray being explored.
When Picard went to the archives to find the painting, and he was being guided into the archives, I thought that was an android. I thought it was synthetic, and it turned out to be a hologram, but it looked like you would imagine what a robot would look like as portrayed in Star Trek.
Yeah, so it's this interesting sort of future where we're not worried about AI in terms of what it can do unless it has a physical form almost.
Yeah, I mean, Norm, you brought this up in another discussion we had, like the EMH from Voyager, the emergency medical hologram. Central character had a whole episode about this kind of theme, that like holograms even have potential sentience and rights and ethics to them. So are they going to delve in that, or are they going to stay in this narrow window of just the synthetics for this. I think given the 10 episode run, we're probably going to see them narrowly focused towards the synthetics just because of plot. But I think that whole landscape is open to them.
Yeah, so you both brought up politics a lot. Let's dive into that. Politics of Starfleet and like what we're learning about like where like, Picard leaving Starfleet and to kind of getting an idea of where the politics are currently. Like I saw one take on the internet saying this is the most political TV show on right now. I was like, well, I don't necessarily agree with that at all. But
yeah, I don't agree with that. But Star Trek was the most political show in the 60s when it came on. So it's always made statements. I feel like this is not different than that. It's front and center in that interview when the interviewer says, but Romulan lives, and he says, no lives. Mm-hmm. That's about as political statement as you can get. And that theme has been throughout every Star Trek series we've seen. They've battled against that theme over and over again. So I don't see this as being different.
Yeah.
It just feels really close to modern day activities that are happening now. And Patrick Stewart said as much.
Yeah.
In that sense, I think it's a little bit different than kind of the vision that Gene Roddenberry set up for Star Trek, the utopia of the Federation, which was really kind of a level playing field for then, a canvas to have stories that then were clear analogs to what was happening in the 60s in the real world, right? So issues of race and politics. And but that idea is ripe to peel back, and behind every utopia is perhaps a dark side, and it's been explored in past Star Trek, but it's clearly the perfection of Starfleet is something that isn't taken for granted anymore.
This is the place that's probably most uncomfortable for me about this series, because Jean-Luc Picard, that I remember, and I want to be very cautious about saying this, that I remember was such a bastion for hope, such a bastion of morality and just fighting for the things that humanity cares about the most at its core. And the Picard we see is very different now. He's broken. And I worry that the series, by delving into that non-utopian, sort of more realistic future, will break that spirit of who we knew Jean-Luc Picard to be. I miss the optimistic parts of Star Trek, and I hope that comes shining through in some way. Even on like some of the series where there was war, there's still that note of optimism. And that really wasn't what Discovery has been about to this point.
Oh gosh, Discovery's been very dark. But I think you see it in a lot of the optimism. You can view it through a different lens, but in some of the world building, you still have this super utopia, sort of cities that you're seeing. You're not, at least in the first episode, they're not showing slums. They're not showing, that Earth is like really dire, or that we've been encased in fire for years, or anything like that. You're seeing these beautiful Star Trek, Starfleet-like cities, that maybe show that, you're still in this delightful universe, but maybe they're trying to juxtapose that against, some of the decisions that have been made politically
to make that happen, or to keep that existing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we've seen like in the Star Trek, the history, like the fake history of the future, like they went through World War III and Earth was in shambles until they discovered warp technology. And that was the promise. You achieve warp technology, then you get to join the shared technologies between
Norm,
species and culture.
Such a cult of Zephram Cochrane over here.
and that was like the promise of the Federation. I didn't expect Picard to not be in Starfleet. I mean, retired, yes, but the idea that he left, that really... maybe they're trying to tell a generational story, and maybe we'll get exposed to later who comprises Starfleet today, because that's also something we haven't really seen. Yeah, we saw like the era of Kirk and the era of TNG, DS9, and Voyager, but in the same way that in the real world there are differences between the baby boomers and millennials, and not that the values aren't the same, but the way they manifest and the way the world changes, the way people, they're different. And maybe we'll find the optimism reveal itself in a different way, in a more maybe pragmatic way in the future of Star Trek.
Yeah. So, I guess going into a slightly different angle, was there any tech or things that you saw in the first episode that really delighted you? Things that were
What I like
exciting?
the evolution of is we're so used to tablet type displays from TOS through TNG, Voyager, DS9. We finally got more of like the holographic heads up type displays in how they were communicating. I actually thought that was a neat little touch for it. That was a nod to like, yes, Star Trek laid the groundwork for like the iPad essentially, but you know, the iPad was 10 years ago now. So it was like a nice little sort of nod of evolution in tech there.
I really like their depiction of the archives. The fact that you still need, even though you have holograms and you have, you know, databases of things, you still need to go somewhere for a physical archive. And the way they had, you know, the folding covers and the librarian, whatever that character was, to the archivist to guide Picard through, like that was a cool place.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I mean, it was perhaps the most, showy tech in the first episode, the sort of AR glasses that they put on Daj at the beginning, and they're sort of seemingly scanning through her brain to like try and find out, her information. And I thought it was interesting that they physically put something kind of over each ear or kind of in front of each eye as glasses, and then an AR sort of glasses sort of emerges from that, and it allows them to scan. So again, just an interesting thing that we didn't see that much of in the original sort of Picard universe.
They seem to amp up the transporter. How like those, like whoever those like rogue like assassins are, they seem to be like transporting wherever they want to go. So I wonder if there's something there with that like more site to site kind of transporter level kind of stuff. That we're going to see. We even saw in one of the fights, one of the assassins get transported sort of like mid getting kicked over a rail. So I'm curious. Like I've always loved the transporter. Any of the conversations around buffers, I'm in on all of those episodes. Heisenberg compensators, in. So I really want to see if they do something with that.
I'll be really curious to see if there will be a ship, because every Star Trek show, as much as it's about a crew, one of the characters is the ship that they're on. Even with Deep Space Nine, the station, and then also the Defiant. And while Picard is no longer a captain, will he have a crew? Will there be a ship? Because I'm a fan of.
Hope
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So my final question is, what would you say that Star Trek Picard actually adds to the Star Trek universe? Obviously we know it's an evolution and that is going further down the timeline, but as a show that's like adding to the plethora of things, all things Star Trek that exists, what is the unique thing that it's adding to this portfolio?
There's two things, and it's sort of a continuation. I think DS9 is the first Star Trek that I watched that had longer arcs of stories to it. They had season-long arcs, but still in that sort of contained episodic way. And then when we got to Discovery, we got kind of more of that sort of season-long. We have a confined 10-episode story set in the future, so that's one, like the continued evolution of that form of storytelling. But more importantly, it's so much slower. It's so much more focused on one person, at least this point. Like, it's the small thing. I'm used to Star Trek being about the galaxy. And I love this contained Star Trek as a different way of telling these like personal stories. And it's not, I'm hopping on my ship and racing over to this thing, or there's this huge, galaxy ending event that's going to happen. So I'm really excited about that entry to the genre. I think that's what Enterprise, that initial show, was really trying to do, but never quite kind of hit the note for me.
I like that they're showing a lot more of Earth, and that we don't typically see a lot of what Earth looks like in the 24th century, now new in 25th century here in Star Trek. And mostly it's, we see Starfleet Academy, Starfleet headquarters, but now hopefully we could see a little bit more of, what the people on Earth are doing, as there are fleets out there on these 5-year, 10-year missions exploring the galaxy on the home front.
Did they ever build any more housing in San Francisco? This is the show where we can find out.
They don't need that. You can live on, well, not Mars. You can live on the moon.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things I like about this show is that you get that sort of interplay of Mars and Earth more. So yeah, you're back home, but you get to sort of get that context of like, well, how did they really set up the solar system? If everyone's out there on these ships, and there is a short trek out there called Children of Mars that shows a little bit more context of like what happened on Mars, just a little bit, a tiny taste. So that's really fascinating. Well, anyway, thank you both so much for being on the show today, and thank you for bringing Picard wine. This is lovely.
Thank you, Jean-Luc.
Yes.
Well, just like this wine, Ariel, I thought that conversation was pretty good.
It was fun. Like I love diving into all this stuff. And I think, at least our little mini panel of discussion represents, me who's on the casual Star Trek side to you and Kishore who are definitely deep in the thick of Star Trek geekery. But, the thing that I liked as a casual fan of this episode so much was that they just dive right into everything and they explain everything and they have characters reveal different information that they discover throughout the whole episode. So really they don't like tease it out and make you wait for someone to tell someone else about what they've discovered. They really explain it all so that you just can hit the ground running and just have fun in this new world of Star Trek. And I thought that was really great.
There's plenty of new stuff, new characters that they're unveiling that together we'll kind of learn and go on this 10-week journey and these 10 episodes. But I'm also looking forward to reading about the Easter eggs, things that are going to be for Star Trek fans. And hopefully that's something that new fans will be able to enjoy as well, the context behind all these relationships and all these things they mentioned. We'll possibly be coming back to Star Trek Picard in the future as the show ends and kind of recapping the entire series. But you can always watch Offworld on not only the YouTube channel, but also listen to it as a podcast. Just go to tested.com/offworld, and that's where we'll see you next time.